The people we overlook every day often see us more clearly than the people sitting in the corner office. At exactly 7:30 on a gray Monday morning, the revolving glass doors of Morgan Financial Group welcomed another wave of sharply dressed employees into the 48-story headquarters overlooking downtown Seattle. Designer briefcases, expensive coffee cups, polished shoes, and hurried conversations filled the marble lobby as another workweek officially began. Almost no one noticed the man pushing a quiet janitor's cart across the freshly polished floor. Daniel Morgan adjusted the simple blue maintenance uniform hanging loosely over his athletic frame before lowering the brim of his faded work cap. The expensive watches and tailored suits that normally defined one of America's youngest billionaire chief executive officers had been replaced by worn work gloves and comfortable work boots. Even the neatly trimmed beard he usually maintained had been allowed to grow slightly fuller, making him almost impossible to recognize. Only one person inside the building knew his true identity. Hector Diaz, the head of maintenance, leaned against his mop with crossed arms and quietly shook his head. "You still have time to change your mind," he said. Daniel smiled faintly. "That is exactly why I cannot." Hector sighed with the patience of someone who had spent 3 decades cleaning offices that executives rarely noticed. "You really believe spending 1 week as a janitor is going to teach you something the reports cannot?" Daniel looked around the busy lobby where hundreds of employees hurried past without making eye contact with the people emptying trash cans or wiping fingerprints from the glass doors. "I think the reports tell me how the company performs," he answered calmly. "I want to learn how the people inside it feel." Hector nodded slowly. He had worked in the building long enough to understand exactly what Daniel meant. Employee satisfaction surveys had quietly revealed a troubling pattern over the past year. Productivity remained high. Profits continued breaking records, yet comments describing loneliness, disrespect, and invisible workplace divisions appeared more often than anyone expected. Daniel wanted to see those divisions with his own eyes instead of reading about them inside spreadsheets. As employees streamed toward the elevators, Daniel quietly began polishing fingerprints from the stainless steel panels beside the lobby entrance. Most people passed without a glance. A few continued business calls while walking directly across the section he had just cleaned. One executive accidentally dropped a paper coffee sleeve less than 3 feet from the recycling bin before continuing toward the elevators without looking back. Daniel bent down, picked it up, and placed it where it belonged. Nobody noticed. Nobody thanked him. The building had already taught him its first lesson before 8 o'clock. Invisible work often remained invisible because people stopped seeing the person doing it. 20 floors above the lobby, Emma Collins hurried through the accounting department, carrying a stack of financial reports balanced carefully against her shoulder while checking the time on her phone. At 29, she had spent the last 3 years rebuilding her life after becoming a single mother. Every morning followed the same exhausting rhythm. Wake before sunrise. Prepare breakfast. Walk her 6-year-old daughter Sophie to school. Catch 2 buses downtown. Arrive early enough that no one noticed she occasionally looked tired. Her simple lunch sat inside a reusable cloth bag tucked neatly beneath her desk because buying lunch downtown every day simply was not part of her budget. Emma never complained. She believed gratitude could exist beside struggle. Around noon, the office cafeteria filled with conversations, laughter, and the smell of warm meals. Emma quietly carried her homemade turkey sandwich, apple slices, and small container of vegetable soup toward a quiet corner table. Before sitting down, she glanced through the cafeteria windows overlooking the service hallway. A lone maintenance worker sat on an overturned supply bucket beside his cleaning cart, opening a small paper napkin that contained nothing more than 2 plain crackers and a bottle of water. He looked completely alone. Around him, dozens of employees walked past carrying full lunch trays without slowing down. Emma hesitated only for a moment before lowering her own lunch onto the cafeteria table. Something inside her refused to keep eating while another person sat only a few yards away with almost nothing. She quietly picked up her lunch bag again and walked toward the service hallway, completely unaware that the quiet janitor she was about to meet owned every floor beneath her feet. You can learn a lot about a person by the way they treat someone who has nothing to offer them. Daniel Morgan heard those words years ago from his father, but somewhere between building $1 billion company and managing thousands of employees, he had forgotten how powerful they were. Now, sitting alone in the quiet service hallway beneath the company cafeteria, wearing a simple janitor uniform instead of a designer suit, he found himself remembering. Daniel opened the small paper bag containing his lunch and looked down at the plain meal prepared by the catering service assigned to building employees. It was not bad. It was simply forgettable. Everything about his current situation felt strangely unfamiliar. For most of his adult life, people approached him because of his position. They wanted meetings, partnerships, approvals, opportunities. Very few people ever approached him because they simply wanted to know how he was doing. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Daniel looked up and saw Emma Collins standing a few feet away, holding a cloth lunch bag in one hand. She seemed uncertain, as though she was debating whether she should speak or leave. "Excuse me," she said softly. Daniel immediately stood. "Yes." Emma glanced at the empty hallway before looking back at him. "I noticed you usually eat here alone." Daniel looked slightly surprised. "Usually?" Emma smiled gently. "I work upstairs. I pass through here sometimes." He nodded slowly, still unsure where the conversation was going. Emma opened her lunch bag and removed a carefully packed container. "I made too much today." Daniel looked at the small portion she offered. "You do not have to do that." "I know." Her answer came quickly, almost as if she had expected him to refuse. "I just thought maybe you would like some company." For a moment, Daniel had no response. It was such a simple gesture that it somehow felt more meaningful than any expensive gift he had ever received. He looked around the quiet hallway. "You are sure?" Emma smiled. "It is only lunch." Daniel sat down slowly as she joined him at the small table near the supply room. Neither of them knew that the security cameras above them were capturing the most important moment of Daniel's entire week. Not because of the meal, because for the first time since entering his own company disguised as someone else, he was being treated like a person instead of a title. "I am Daniel," he said, using only his first name. Emma nodded. Emma. She did not ask what department he worked in. She did not ask how long he had been with the company. She simply opened her container and divided the food between them. "Turkey sandwich, vegetables, and an apple," she explained. "Nothing fancy." Daniel smiled slightly. "It looks better than most lunches I have had recently." Emma laughed softly. "That sounds like something someone says when they eat expensive food every day." Daniel almost laughed at the irony. If she only knew. "Maybe I just appreciate simple things." Emma studied him briefly, then nodded as though she accepted that answer. During the next few minutes, their conversation moved naturally. Emma talked about her daughter Sophie, who loved drawing animals and asking endless questions about everything she saw. Daniel listened carefully, asking about the little details most people would overlook. "She sounds wonderful," he said. Emma smiled proudly. "She is. She reminds me that even difficult days can have good moments." Daniel looked down at the lunch they were sharing. Those words stayed with him. Emma never complained about working long hours. She never mentioned the challenges she faced. She spoke about her responsibilities with quiet strength rather than frustration. Before leaving, Emma packed the remaining food back into her bag. "Thank you for keeping me company," Daniel said. She smiled. "I should be thanking you. It was nice not eating alone either." After she walked away, Daniel remained seated for several minutes, looking at the empty table. A simple lunch. A simple conversation. Yet somehow it revealed more about the heart of his company than any employee report ever had. Above him, executives were discussing profits, growth, and future plans. Down here, in a quiet hallway most people ignored, Daniel Morgan had discovered something far more valuable. He had discovered the person who saw him before she ever knew his name. The next morning, Daniel Morgan arrived at the office before most employees had even parked their cars. The familiar glass tower stood above the city like a symbol of everything he had built, but for the first time in years, he entered through the service entrance instead of the executive elevator. He carried the same maintenance card, wore the same simple uniform, and moved through the same hallways where thousands of employees walked every day without noticing the people who kept everything running. Yet something felt different. Daniel was no longer simply observing. He was searching for answers. The lunch he shared with Emma Collins stayed in his mind long after she returned to the accounting department. It was not the sandwich, the conversation, or even the kindness itself that surprised him most. It was the fact that she offered it without knowing who he was, without knowing his name, without knowing he controlled the building they stood inside. She had looked at him and seen a person, That was something Daniel had not experienced often enough. During his morning rounds, Daniel paid closer attention to everything around him. He noticed the security guard who quietly held the elevator door open for employees every morning. He noticed the receptionist who answered hundreds of questions with patience despite never receiving recognition. He noticed the maintenance workers who arrived before sunrise and left after everyone else had gone home. Every hallway told a different story, and most of those stories never reached the executive floor. Around noon, Daniel returned to the same service hallway where Emma had shared her lunch with him. He expected nothing. He was simply curious whether yesterday had been a moment of kindness or the beginning of a pattern. A few minutes later, Emma appeared carrying her lunch bag again. When she saw him, she smiled immediately. "You are here again." Daniel smiled back. "Looks like it." She sat down at the small table without hesitation. "I hope you do not mind if I join you again." Daniel shook his head. "I would like that." Their conversation continued naturally, and Daniel noticed something remarkable. Emma never spoke about herself as someone unlucky. She talked about responsibilities, goals, and the future. She mentioned her daughter Sophie proudly, describing her drawings, her curiosity, and her dream of becoming a veterinarian someday. "She sounds like a wonderful kid," Daniel said. Emma smiled. "She reminds me that small things matter." Daniel looked down at his lunch. "What do you mean?" Emma thought for a moment. "A good morning. A kind word. Someone remembering your name. People think happiness comes from big moments, but most of life is made of little ones." The words stayed with him. They were simple, but they carried a truth that many people in his world had forgotten. Later that afternoon, Daniel witnessed something that changed the way he viewed his company. He was cleaning the hallway outside the accounting department when he heard a conversation nearby. Richard Wells, a department manager, stood speaking with a maintenance worker about a small mistake in the schedule. His tone was impatient and dismissive, treating the employee as though his time mattered less than everyone else's. Daniel remained quiet, watching carefully. Then Emma stepped out of her office. She did not raise her voice. She did not create a scene. She simply approached and calmly explained that everyone working in the building deserved respect. Richard looked surprised that someone from accounting would defend a janitor. Emma only replied, "A job title does not decide someone's value." Daniel felt those words deeper than she could imagine. For years, he had believed his company culture could be measured through numbers, reports, and performance reviews. But standing there in a simple uniform, he finally understood something important. Culture was not created in conference rooms. It was created in ordinary moments when nobody important was watching. That evening, Daniel returned to the empty executive office after everyone had gone home. He removed the janitor badge from his shirt and placed it on the desk beside his company's nameplate. For the first time, he was not thinking like a CEO evaluating employees. He was thinking like a person who had finally seen the truth from the ground level. And the person who revealed it to him was the woman who had simply decided that no one should eat lunch alone. The following morning, Daniel Morgan stood in front of the mirror inside a small maintenance office instead of the executive bathroom on the top floor. The reflection looking back at him was unfamiliar, yet strangely more honest. The simple uniform, the worn work boots, the name tag that only said Daniel. For the first time in years, nobody walking past him knew his position, his company, or the size of his bank account. They only knew the person standing in front of them. And somehow that felt more revealing than any business meeting he had ever attended. Daniel returned to his routine with a different perspective. He no longer saw the building as a collection of departments and performance numbers. He saw individual people carrying stories that had never reached the executive floor. During his morning rounds, he noticed Emma Collins arriving earlier than most employees. She carried a small bag containing school papers, a coffee cup, and a handwritten note from her daughter Sophie that she carefully placed beside her computer before beginning work. Daniel watched from a distance as Emma answered emails, organized reports, and quietly helped a coworker who was struggling with a spreadsheet. She never acted as though helping others was an inconvenience. It seemed natural to her. Later that morning, Daniel crossed paths with Richard Wells, the accounting manager he had observed the previous day. Richard was known as one of the company's most efficient leaders, but efficiency was not always the same as leadership. He walked through the office with confidence, expecting everyone around him to adjust to his schedule. When he noticed Daniel cleaning near the accounting area, he barely looked up. "Can you move this cart? It is blocking the hallway." Daniel calmly moved it aside. Of course. Richard walked away without another word. A few minutes later, Emma stepped out of her office carrying a stack of documents. She noticed Daniel returning to his cleaning duties and smiled. "Good morning, Daniel." The simple greeting made him pause. She was the only person in the department who consistently used his name. "Good morning, Emma." Before they could continue talking, Richard approached with a frustrated expression. "Emma, those reports were supposed to be finished already." Emma looked at the documents in her hands. "I completed the review. I was just preparing the final copies." Richard glanced toward Daniel. Some people spend too much time talking when they should focus on work. The comment was subtle, but the message was clear. Daniel lowered his eyes and continued wiping the nearby desk. He had heard similar comments many times during his week undercover. Small dismissals, small assumptions, small moments where people were valued differently because of their job title. Emma noticed too. She placed the reports down and calmly turned toward Richard. "Respectfully, Daniel was not distracting me. He was doing his job." Richard looked surprised that she had responded. "I did not say he was not." Emma held his gaze. "The way we speak about people matters." The hallway became quiet. Several employees nearby looked up from their desks. Emma continued in a calm voice. "Everyone here contributes to this company. Some people prepare financial reports. Some people maintain the spaces where we work. Both roles matter." Daniel stood completely still. He had heard executives give speeches about company values countless times. But Emma was not giving a speech. She was simply saying what she believed. Richard gave a brief nod before walking away, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation ending differently than he expected. Once he was gone, Emma turned back toward Daniel. "I hope that was not awkward." Daniel smiled slightly. "Not at all. Sometimes people forget that everyone has a story." Daniel looked at her with quiet admiration. "You really believe that?" Emma nodded. "I do." That afternoon, Daniel returned to the hidden office space Hector had prepared for him. He removed his maintenance badge and placed it beside a notebook filled with observations from the week. Most of the pages contained notes about systems, procedures, and workplace habits. But near the end, one sentence stood apart from everything else. "People do not need to be reminded that they are employees. They need to be reminded that they are human." Daniel stared at those words for a long moment. He had entered his own company looking for problems. Instead, he had discovered something more important. He had discovered the people who quietly held it together. And at the center of that discovery was Emma Collins, the woman who shared her lunch with a stranger because she believed nobody deserved to feel invisible. The days that followed changed something inside Daniel Morgan that no business strategy ever had. Before entering the office each morning, he no longer thought about quarterly results or investor expectations first. He thought about the people walking through the building doors. He wondered who arrived exhausted, who carried worries they never shared, and who quietly contributed without ever hearing the words "thank you." His week disguised as a janitor was supposed to reveal problems. Instead, it revealed humanity. And Emma Collins continued to show him what that looked like. Every afternoon, she returned to the same small table in the service hallway with her lunch bag in hand. Sometimes she brought extra fruit. Sometimes she brought homemade cookies Sophie had helped prepare the night before. She never made a big announcement about it. She never treated Daniel like she was doing him a favor. To her, sharing a meal was simply something people did when someone else needed a little kindness. One afternoon, Daniel asked a question that had been quietly forming in his mind. "Why do you do that?" Emma looked up from her sandwich. "Do what?" "Take time for people you barely know." Emma smiled slightly. "Because I know what it feels like when nobody notices you." The answer surprised him. She looked down at her lunch container before continuing. "When Sophie was younger, there were days when I felt like I was trying to carry everything alone. Working, parenting, paying bills, making sure she felt loved. Sometimes the smallest kindness from another person made the hardest days easier." Daniel listened carefully. "Someone did that for you?" Emma nodded. "A neighbor once brought dinner after a difficult week. She did not solve my problems. She did not change my life. She just reminded me I was not invisible." Those words stayed with Daniel. Not invisible. That was exactly what many people inside his company had become. Invisible. Later that week, Daniel asked Hector to walk with him through the building after closing hours. The usually crowded halls were now quiet, illuminated only by soft overhead lights. They passed empty offices, conference rooms, and employee lounges. I built this company believing success meant creating opportunities, Daniel said. But I think I forgot something important. Hector looked at him. What? Daniel stopped near the service elevator. Opportunities mean nothing if people do not feel respected while they are here. Hector nodded slowly. Sounds like someone finally listened. Daniel smiled. Someone reminded me. The next morning, Daniel witnessed another moment that changed his understanding of Emma. He saw her in the employee break room, helping a new intern understand a complicated accounting system. She was already behind on her own workload, yet she still took 10 minutes to help someone who could offer her nothing in return. When the intern thanked her, Emma simply smiled and said, "Everyone was new once." Daniel watched from the hallway, realizing that her kindness was not something she displayed only when someone was watching. It was part of who she was. That afternoon, Daniel received an urgent message from his executive team. A major client presentation required his attention. The board wanted him back in his office immediately. For the first time during his undercover assignment, returning to the executive floor felt complicated. The old Daniel would have rushed upstairs without hesitation. The CEO who built Morgan Financial Group would have prioritized the meeting above everything else. But the man wearing the janitor uniform paused. He looked toward the service hallway where Emma sat eating lunch alone, leaving half of her sandwich untouched because she was saving it for Sophie after school. He realized the biggest lesson of the week was not about employees. It was about himself. Leadership was not standing above people and expecting them to follow. Leadership was standing among them and understanding what they carried. Daniel returned to his hidden office that evening and opened a blank document. At the top, he wrote one sentence. A company is not built by the people with the highest titles. It is built by the people who show up every day. He stared at the words for a long time. Then his phone rang. It was his executive assistant. "Mr. Morgan, the board is asking when you will return." Daniel looked at the janitor badge sitting beside his laptop. For the first time, he knew exactly what kind of leader he wanted to become when he finally walked back into that room. The following morning, Daniel Morgan made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of continuing his observation from a distance, he chose to spend more time among the people who rarely had a voice in executive meetings. He wanted to understand their daily experiences, not through surveys or statistics, but through conversations. The service areas of Morgan Financial Group had become a completely different world to him. A world filled with people who arrived early, stayed late, and rarely received recognition. Around noon, Daniel returned to the small hallway table where he and Emma Collins had shared their first lunch. He expected the same quiet conversation as before, but this time Emma arrived carrying 2 small containers instead of 1. Daniel looked at the extra meal with surprise. "You did not have to bring another one." Emma smiled. "I know, but Sophie helped me make these cookies last night, and she insisted I share them with someone." Daniel laughed softly. "She sounds like a thoughtful kid." "She is." Emma placed the cookies between them. "She asked me why I always bring lunch for you." Daniel looked curious. "What did you tell her?" Emma smiled. "I told her that everyone deserves to feel noticed." Those words stayed with Daniel long after lunch ended. Later that afternoon, he continued walking through the building, but his attention was drawn toward the employees who worked behind the scenes. He noticed a security guard quietly helping an elderly visitor find the correct office. He noticed a receptionist staying late to organize paperwork after everyone else had left. He noticed maintenance workers repairing small problems before anyone realized there had been an issue. The company was not held together only by executives in expensive offices. It was held together by thousands of small acts nobody celebrated. That evening, Daniel met with Hector in the maintenance room. The older man looked at him carefully. "You are thinking differently now." Daniel leaned against the work table. "I thought I understood my company." Hector smiled slightly. "And now?" Daniel looked through the small window toward the busy city outside. "Now I realize I only understood the parts one was able to see." Hector nodded. "That happens to a lot of people with power." The next day, Daniel decided to follow Emma's department during their regular work schedule. He wanted to understand the environment that shaped someone like her. What he found surprised him. Emma was not the highest-ranking employee. She did not have the largest office or the most influence. Yet people naturally came to her when they needed help. A new employee asked her how to complete a complicated report. A coworker needed advice about organizing a difficult project. Even employees outside her department stopped to greet her. She remembered names. She listened carefully. She made people feel valued. Daniel watched as she stayed after hours to help organize files, even though nobody asked her to. When he later saw her leaving the building with a tired expression, he noticed she immediately smiled when she saw a message from Sophie waiting on her phone. The message was a simple drawing of two people holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Emma saved it carefully before putting her phone away. Daniel realized something important. Emma did not have an easy life, but she had created a meaningful one. That evening, Daniel returned to his executive office after everyone had gone home. The contrast between the quiet luxury above and the crowded working floors below felt impossible to ignore. His office had everything. A beautiful view, expensive furniture, every convenience money could provide. Yet the small hallway table where he shared lunch with Emma had given him something his office never had: connection. He opened his computer and reviewed employee feedback reports from the previous year. This time, he did not read them like numbers. He read them like stories. Every complaint represented a person. Every suggestion represented someone hoping things could improve. Before leaving for the night, Daniel removed the temporary janitor badge from his pocket and placed it beside his company identification card. He looked at both for a long moment. One represented the title everyone respected. The other represented the people everyone overlooked. And for the first time, Daniel understood that the second one had taught him more about leadership than the first ever could. The moment Daniel Morgan realized the truth about his company culture was not during a board meeting or a financial review. It happened in a quiet hallway where one employee decided that a person's job title did not determine their worth. That moment stayed with him. But there was another lesson waiting just around the corner. A lesson about what happened when kindness was tested under pressure. The following afternoon, Daniel was cleaning the main corridor near the accounting department when he noticed a group of employees gathered around a discussion board. The company had recently announced a new internal suggestion program, allowing workers from every department to share ideas about improving daily operations. Most employees walked past it without stopping. Emma Collins, however, paused to read the comments carefully. Daniel watched from a distance as she noticed several handwritten notes from maintenance workers describing small problems they faced every day. She took out her phone and began writing reminders. Later that afternoon, Daniel saw Emma speaking with Richard Wells again. This time, Richard looked more frustrated than before. "Emma, you cannot keep involving yourself in every department's issues," he said. Emma remained calm. "I am not involving myself. I am listening." Richard shook his head. "Your job is accounting, not solving everyone's problems." Emma looked at the notes in her hand. A company works because different people solve different problems. Daniel quietly watched the conversation from the hallway. He expected Emma to step back. Many employees would have. It was easier to avoid conflict with someone who had authority over your career. But Emma continued respectfully. If someone has a concern, they deserve to be heard. Richard looked uncomfortable, but eventually walked away. Daniel noticed something important. Emma was not brave because she wanted recognition. She was brave because she believed the right thing mattered even when nobody was rewarding her for it. That evening, Daniel met Hector in the maintenance room again. The older man was organizing supplies when Daniel entered. "You found something, didn't you?" Hector asked. Daniel smiled slightly. "I found many things." "About the company?" Daniel shook his head. "About people." Hector nodded as though he expected that answer. The hardest thing about leadership is remembering that every number on a report represents a person. Daniel looked at the maintenance badge hanging from his shirt. "I used to think employees wanted more from leadership." "They do," Hector replied. "But not always what you think." Daniel waited. "Most people want to know their work matters." Those words followed Daniel throughout the evening. The next morning, he decided to spend time with employees outside his usual observation areas. He visited the loading area, the break rooms, and the service floors. Everywhere he went, he found people who cared deeply about their work but rarely felt seen. A security employee explained how he helped new visitors navigate the building. A cafeteria worker described remembering the favorite drinks of regular employees. A cleaning staff member mentioned fixing small problems before they became larger issues. These were not details found in financial reports. They were the heartbeat of the company. Later that day, Emma found Daniel sitting alone during lunch. She placed her container on the table and smiled. "You look like you are thinking about something serious." Daniel laughed quietly. "I probably am." Emma opened her lunch. "That happens often. More than I would like." She smiled. Sometimes the best answers come when people stop looking for complicated solutions. Daniel looked at her. Is that something you learned? Emma nodded. Life taught me. He wanted to ask more, but he respected that some stories needed time. Instead, they ate lunch in comfortable silence. For Daniel, that silence felt different from the silence of his executive office. The office silence came from distance. This silence came from trust. That night, Daniel returned to the top floor and looked through the glass walls of his office at the city below. Tomorrow he would have to return to his real position. The disguise could not last forever. The company needed its CEO back. But the man who returned would not be the same one who left. Because a week spent walking through hallways as a janitor had shown Daniel something his billions never could. The true value of a company was never measured by the people sitting at the top. It was measured by the people quietly carrying it from the ground up. The final day of Daniel Morgan's undercover assignment arrived faster than he expected. For 1 week, he had walked through his own company as a person nobody noticed. He had pushed cleaning carts through crowded hallways, eaten lunch in quiet corners, and listened to conversations that would never happen inside the executive boardroom. Now he stood inside the small maintenance office with the janitor uniform still hanging on his shoulders, knowing that soon everything would change. Hector leaned against the doorway and watched him carefully. You are ready? He asked. Daniel looked down at the simple name tag attached to his shirt. I think I am ready to understand what happens next. Hector smiled. Most people in your position would be worried about being recognized. Daniel shook his head. I am more worried about forgetting what I learned. Before leaving the maintenance area, Daniel stopped by the cafeteria hallway one last time. The small table where Emma Collins had shared her lunch with him looked exactly the same as it had on the first day. Ordinary, quiet, almost invisible. Yet that table represented the most important conversation he had experienced in years. As he walked away, he noticed Emma approaching with her lunch bag. She smiled when she saw him. You are leaving early today? Daniel paused. For a moment, he forgot that their conversations would soon become complicated. Yes, something important is happening. Emma looked at him curiously. Everything okay? Daniel smiled gently. Better than okay. She nodded, though she seemed slightly surprised by his answer. I hope whatever happens goes well. Those simple words meant more to him than she could know. She wished him success without knowing he already had more success than most people could imagine. She supported him without expecting anything in return. A few hours later, Daniel entered the executive elevator for the first time in a week. The same elevator he used almost every day before the disguise. The same mirrored walls. The same quiet music. But he felt like a different person standing inside it. When the doors opened on the top floor, Olivia Bennett was waiting with several documents in her hands. She stopped when she saw him. Mr. Morgan. Daniel smiled. It is good to see you, Olivia. She looked at the janitor badge still attached to his shirt and laughed softly. I have to admit, I never expected you to actually complete the entire week. Daniel removed the badge carefully. Neither did I. Olivia handed him the latest employee feedback summary. The board meeting begins in 30 minutes. They want your report on the undercover project. Daniel looked at the document, but did not open it. It is not a report. Olivia raised an eyebrow. No. He shook his head. It is a responsibility. When Daniel entered the boardroom, the executives immediately stood. They were used to seeing him in a tailored suit, carrying confidence and authority. Today he wore a simple shirt beneath his jacket, and something about his expression was different. He was still the same CEO, but he was no longer distant. The presentation screen behind him displayed one sentence. People are the foundation of every company. The room became quiet. Daniel spoke about the week he spent outside the executive floor. He did not reveal every personal conversation. He did not embarrass anyone. He simply shared what he discovered. He talked about employees who felt invisible. He talked about the importance of respect. He talked about how small acts of kindness revealed the true character of a workplace. Then he mentioned one person who changed his understanding completely. I met an employee who shared her lunch with someone she believed was just another worker in this building, Daniel said. She did not ask about his position. She did not care about his title. She only noticed that he was alone. The executives listened carefully. Daniel continued. That moment reminded me that leadership is not about being seen. It is about seeing others. After the meeting ended, Daniel remained alone in the boardroom for several minutes. He looked through the glass walls toward the city below. The view was the same. The office was the same. The company was the same. But he was not. Later that afternoon, Emma received an unexpected invitation to attend a company-wide meeting. She entered the auditorium with hundreds of employees, unsure why she had been invited. Then the lights dimmed, and Daniel Morgan walked onto the stage. The room erupted with surprise. Emma stood completely still as she recognized the man she knew as Daniel from the service hallway, the janitor who shared lunch with her. The man she believed was simply someone trying to get through the day. Now he stood before the entire company as the billionaire CEO. And for the first time, Emma understood that the person she had shown kindness to had been watching, learning, and remembering everything. The entire auditorium remained silent as Daniel Morgan stood beneath the bright stage lights, no longer wearing a janitor uniform, but carrying the same humility that had defined the past week. Hundreds of employees watched him with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Some recognized the man immediately. Others struggled to connect the CEO, standing before them with the quiet worker who had pushed a cleaning cart through the same hallways only days earlier. Emma Collins stood near the back of the room, still trying to process everything she had just discovered. The man she had shared lunch with was not simply another employee. He was the person whose decisions affected everyone inside the building. Yet when she looked at him on stage, she did not see a billionaire. She saw Daniel, the man who listened, the man who asked about Sophie, the man who thanked her for a simple lunch as if it were something valuable. Daniel looked across the room and found Emma among the crowd. For a brief moment, the entire auditorium disappeared. He remembered the small service hallway, the shared meal, and the words she had spoken without knowing who he was. Everyone deserves to feel noticed. Daniel took a slow breath before speaking. I know many of you are surprised today. His voice was calm and steady. You may be wondering why the person who usually makes decisions from the top floor spent a week working in the halls below. A quiet smile appeared on his face. The answer is simple. I wanted to remember what it feels like to be part of the company without a title attached to my name. The employees listened carefully. Daniel explained that he had spent the week learning from people across the organization. He mentioned the maintenance teams who kept the building running, the support staff who solved problems before anyone noticed them, and employees who continued showing dedication even when their work happened behind the scenes. I discovered something important, Daniel continued. The strongest companies are not built by a few people at the top. They are built by thousands of people who choose to show up every day. The room remained completely focused. Then Daniel looked toward Emma. There was one person who reminded me of this better than anyone else. Emma immediately looked surprised. Daniel smiled gently. She saw someone sitting alone and offered kindness without asking for anything in return. She did not know my position. She did not know my name. She simply saw another person. A soft wave of emotion moved through the audience. Emma lowered her eyes, feeling uncomfortable with so much attention. After the presentation ended, Daniel walked through the crowd instead of returning directly to his office. Employees stopped him with questions, comments, and stories about their own experiences. For the first time, many people felt they were speaking to a leader who understood them. Later that afternoon, Daniel invited Emma to a quiet meeting room overlooking the city. She entered carefully, still unsure how to act around the CEO. Daniel noticed immediately. Please sit down, Emma. She sat across from him. I have to admit, I did not expect this. Daniel smiled. Neither did I. She looked at him thoughtfully. Why did you not tell me? Daniel answered honestly. Because I wanted to know how people treated me when they had no reason to impress me. Emma nodded slowly. And what did you learn? Daniel looked toward the window. That kindness is often found in places where nobody is looking for it. A quiet silence followed. Then Daniel continued. I also learned that some people carry more responsibility than anyone realizes. Emma smiled slightly. You mean the employees? Daniel smiled back. I mean people like you. He did not offer her special treatment. He did not promise rewards because she had been kind to him. Instead, he thanked her for reminding him what leadership should look like. When Emma left the room, she carried no promotion letter and no special favor. She carried something more meaningful. Respect. And as Daniel watched her walk back toward the accounting department, he understood the greatest discovery of his undercover week was not hidden inside the company. It was the simple truth that the people who expect nothing from you often reveal the most about who you truly are. The days after Daniel Morgan revealed his identity were filled with conversations the company had avoided for years. Employees who once walked past each other without speaking began sharing ideas. Managers who rarely left their offices started visiting the departments they led. The atmosphere inside Morgan Financial Group slowly changed, not because of a new policy or a new slogan, but because people finally felt heard. Daniel made one promise during his first company meeting as CEO again. Every employee deserved to know that their contribution mattered. He kept that promise through actions. He created regular listening sessions where employees from every level could share concerns directly. He visited the service floors without cameras or announcements. He asked questions, and, more importantly, he listened to the answers. Emma Collins noticed the difference immediately. She never expected her simple act of sharing lunch to become a moment remembered throughout the company. She also never wanted special attention because of it. When Daniel offered her a leadership opportunity on a new employee experience project, she hesitated. "Are you sure I am the right person?" she asked during their meeting. Daniel smiled. "That is exactly why you are the right person." Emma looked confused. "Why?" "Because you asked that question." He leaned back in his chair. Someone looking only for recognition would have accepted immediately. Someone who understands responsibility thinks about whether they can truly help. Emma accepted the opportunity, but only after making one request. "I want the project to include everyone, not just executives. Everyone." Daniel smiled because he expected nothing less. Months passed, and the changes inside the company became visible. Employees started greeting the maintenance team by name. Break rooms became places where people actually talked instead of simply passing through. Small suggestions from employees led to improvements that made daily work easier for everyone. One afternoon, Daniel visited the cafeteria and saw something that made him stop. Near the same hallway where Emma once shared her lunch with him, a group of employees from different departments sat together. An accountant, a security guard, a receptionist, a maintenance worker. They were sharing a meal and laughing. Daniel stood quietly for a moment, remembering the day he sat there wearing a janitor uniform, wondering whether anyone would ever see beyond the disguise. Now he knew the answer. The right people always would. Later that evening, Daniel attended a small community event where employees and their families gathered outside the company building. Sophie Morgan ran across the lawn carrying a drawing she had made for Emma. "I made this for you," she said proudly. Emma accepted it with surprise. The picture showed a group of people sitting around a table with the words, "Everyone belongs," written above them in colorful letters. Emma smiled warmly. "This is beautiful." Sophie looked at her seriously. "My dad says you taught him something important." Emma glanced toward Daniel, who was speaking with employees nearby. "What did he say?" Sophie smiled. "He said the best leaders are people who remember everyone has a story." Emma looked down at the drawing again. She remembered the quiet hallway, the simple lunch, and the man she believed was just another worker trying to get through the day. She never expected that moment to change an entire company. But perhaps that was the nature of genuine kindness. It never arrived announcing what it would become. It simply began with one person choosing to care. As the evening sunlight faded over the city, Daniel stood beside Emma watching employees and families gather together. "Do you ever think about that first lunch?" he asked. Emma smiled. "Sometimes." "What do you think about it now?" She looked around at the people laughing together. "I think it was never about the food." Daniel nodded. "No." His voice softened. "It was about being seen." And in that moment, Daniel understood the greatest lesson of all. A person does not reveal their true character when they are surrounded by power and success. They reveal it when they believe nobody important is watching. Emma shared her lunch with someone she thought had nothing to offer her. Instead, she gave a billionaire CEO the one thing money could never buy. A reminder of what it means to be human. Several months after Daniel Morgan's return to the executive floor, Morgan Financial Group felt like a different company. The walls were the same. The offices were the same. The city skyline outside the windows remained unchanged. But the people inside the building had changed the way they saw one another. Employees who once worked in separate worlds now shared conversations. Managers who once focused only on deadlines began asking their teams how they were doing. Small moments of respect became part of everyday life. Daniel never forgot the lesson that started everything. He continued visiting the service floors regularly, not as a CEO checking performance, but as a leader staying connected. One morning, he walked through the lobby and noticed a familiar face. An older maintenance worker named Hector was repairing a small issue near the entrance. Daniel smiled. Still keeping this place running? Hector looked up and laughed. Someone has to make sure the important people do not trip over their own success. Daniel smiled at the wisdom behind the joke. Later that afternoon, Daniel invited Emma Collins to his office. This time, the room felt different. The first time she had entered, she felt nervous sitting across from a billionaire CEO. Now, she felt like she was speaking with the same person who once shared lunch with her in a quiet hallway. Daniel placed a folder on the desk. I want you to lead the next phase of our employee connection program. Emma looked surprised. Me? Daniel nodded. Yes. She opened the folder carefully. Inside were project details, responsibilities, and a clear leadership role. Emma looked back at him. Daniel, there are people here with more experience. He smiled. There are people with more years in their positions. That is different. Emma remained quiet. Daniel continued. I have watched how people respond to you. They trust you because you listen before you speak. Emma looked down at the documents. I do not want this because I shared lunch with you. Daniel smiled immediately. Good. Because that is not why you are receiving it. He pointed toward the folder. You are receiving it because you understand people. That answer meant more to Emma than any title could. She accepted the opportunity, but she kept one condition. I want this project to include employees from every department. Daniel smiled. That was the only answer I expected from you. Over the next year, Emma helped create programs that connected employees across the company. Maintenance workers shared ideas with engineers. New employees received mentors. Teams celebrated contributions that had previously gone unnoticed. The company became more productive, but Daniel considered the cultural change the greatest achievement. One evening after work, Daniel and Emma stood near the same cafeteria hallway where their first lunch had happened. The building was quiet, and the evening lights reflected against the polished floors. Do you ever think about how strange that day was? Emma asked with a smile. Daniel laughed softly. Every day. She looked at the small table nearby. I still cannot believe you were sitting there eating lunch like everyone else. Daniel looked at the table thoughtfully. That was the first time in a long time someone talked to me without wanting something. Emma smiled gently. I did not know who you were. Exactly, Daniel replied. That was the point. A few moments of silence passed. Then Emma looked toward the busy city outside. Do you think you would have changed if I had not walked over that day? Daniel considered the question carefully. I think I wanted to change, but I needed someone to remind me why. Their conversation was interrupted by Sophie running through the hallway after a company family event, holding a drawing she had made. She handed it to Emma proudly. Look, the drawing showed many people sitting around one large table. Everyone had different jobs, but everyone was smiling. Above them, Sophie had written one sentence. Everyone belongs. Emma looked at Daniel, who smiled quietly. It was the same message that had started with a simple lunch. A message that changed a company. A message that reminded a billionaire CEO that the greatest measure of success was never how many people knew your name. It was how many people felt valued when they stood beside you. Years later, the small moment that changed everything remained one of Daniel Morgan's most treasured memories. Not because it transformed his company, not because it changed the way people viewed him, but because it reminded him that the most meaningful moments in life often begin quietly. A simple lunch, a simple conversation, a simple decision to care. Morgan Financial Group continued to grow, but Daniel never allowed success to separate him from the people who helped build it. Every month, he still visited different departments without announcements. He still ate lunch with employees from every level. He still walked through the same service hallways where he once pushed a janitor cart, remembering the version of himself who needed to learn what leadership truly meant. Emma Collins continued leading the Employee Connection Program, turning it into one of the most respected initiatives in the company. She never chased recognition. She never wanted attention. Her goal remained the same as the day she shared her lunch with a stranger. She wanted people to feel noticed. One afternoon, Daniel invited Emma and her daughter Sophie to a company celebration in the city park. Employees from every department gathered together beneath rows of lights and colorful decorations. There were no separate areas for executives and staff. No reserved tables. No invisible lines dividing people by position. Everyone sat together. Daniel watched as Sophie ran across the grass laughing with other children, while Emma spoke with employees she had helped throughout the year. He smiled quietly. The company had changed, but more importantly, the people inside it had changed. As the evening became calmer, Daniel and Emma walked near the edge of the park where the city lights reflected across the water. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Daniel asked. Emma smiled. "More often than I expected." "What do you remember most?" She thought for a moment. "That you looked like someone who needed a friend, not someone who owned a company." Daniel laughed softly. "That might be the most honest description anyone has ever given me." Emma looked toward the crowd. "I think everyone wants to be seen for who they are, not what they have." Daniel nodded. "That is what you taught me." She smiled. "I only shared lunch." "No," Daniel replied. "You reminded me of something I forgot." A few minutes later, Sophie returned carrying a small gift wrapped in colorful paper. "This is for you," she said to Daniel. He accepted it with surprise. Inside was a framed drawing of the same large table from her previous picture. This time, the words above it were different. "Everyone belongs here." Daniel looked at the drawing quietly. "This is amazing." Sophie smiled proudly. "Mom said the best places are where people are kind." Daniel looked at Emma and smiled. She simply nodded. The following week, Daniel stood in front of a new group of company interns during an orientation meeting. Instead of beginning with company achievements, awards, or financial success, he told them a different story. He told them about the importance of remembering the people who often go unnoticed. He told them that a person's true character is revealed by how they treat someone who cannot offer them anything in return. Years later, when employees talked about Daniel Morgan's greatest achievements, they did not only mention the company's growth or industry awards. They talked about the culture he created. They talked about a CEO who learned to listen. They talked about a woman who shared her lunch without knowing who was sitting across from her. They talked about how one small act of kindness reached far beyond a single meal. Because sometimes the person standing quietly in the corner is carrying a story you have never heard. Sometimes the person you think has nothing to give is the person who gives you the lesson you needed most. And sometimes the greatest success is not found in the height of an office tower, but in the simple moments when one human being chooses to see another. Many years later, the small wooden frame on Daniel Morgan's office shelf still held the same drawing Sophie had created on that unforgettable evening. The paper had become slightly faded with time, but the words remained clear. "Everyone belongs here." Daniel kept it where he could see it every morning before beginning his work. Not as a reminder of a company initiative, not as a symbol of success, but as a reminder of a simple truth that changed his entire life. The world often teaches people to look upward, to admire the person with the biggest office, the largest company, or the most impressive title. But Daniel learned something different. The moments that shape us most often come from the people standing quietly beside us. Emma Collins continued to lead with the same kindness that first brought them together. She became known throughout the company not because of her position, but because of the way she treated people. Employees remembered that she listened before making decisions. They remembered that she noticed when someone needed support. They remembered that she made everyone feel like they belonged. Years after that first lunch, Daniel and Emma returned to the same service hallway where everything began. The company had renovated the area, adding comfortable seating and a small community table where employees from every department could gather. Daniel placed 2 cups of coffee on the table and smiled. "It looks different now." Emma looked around. "Yes, but I think the important part stayed the same." Daniel nodded. "Which part?" She smiled. "People." They sat quietly for a moment, remembering the day when neither of them knew what the future would bring. Daniel looked toward the hallway where employees now greeted each other freely. "Do you know what I find interesting?" Emma looked at him. "What?" "I spent my entire career trying to build something valuable." He smiled softly. "Then you shared your lunch with me, and you showed me the thing I had been missing." Emma laughed gently. "I only shared a sandwich." Daniel shook his head. "No, you shared something much bigger." The years had changed many things. Morgan Financial Group became stronger. Employees became more connected. The company expanded into new communities and created opportunities for thousands of people. But Daniel never allowed the company to forget its foundation. Every new employee heard the same message during orientation. Skills can build a career. Knowledge can build success. But character determines the kind of person you become. One afternoon, Daniel attended a retirement celebration for Hector, the maintenance worker who helped him begin his journey. Employees from every department came to thank him. Some had known him for decades. Others had only met him recently. But everyone shared the same feeling. Hector had made the building feel like a place where people mattered. Daniel stood beside him before the celebration began. "You were right," Daniel said. Hector smiled. "About what?" "I thought I was going to teach myself about the company." Daniel looked around the room, filled with employees laughing together. "Instead, the company taught me about myself." Hector nodded proudly. "That is usually how the best lessons work." As the celebration ended, Daniel looked across the room and saw Emma standing beside Sophie. Sophie was older now, but she still carried the same curiosity and kindness her mother had always encouraged. She waved at Daniel before returning to her conversation. Daniel smiled. He realized that one small act from years earlier had created a chain of moments that reached far beyond anything he could have planned. A lunch shared in a quiet hallway. A conversation between two strangers. A lesson that changed a leader. A culture that changed thousands of lives. Because true success is not measured by how many people know your name. It is measured by how many people feel respected when they stand beside you. And sometimes the person you least expect becomes the person who reminds you who you were always meant to be.